I'm Bob Wachter. I'm chair of the Department of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. I'm also on the board of TDC, have been for the last 7 or 8 years. Today, I hope you leave with some sense of optimism that there's a lot of change coming. Digitization has created a number of problems, and I wrote a book 10 years ago about the electronic health record, and mainly I wrote it out of grumpiness about how hard it had made certain things, how much I was finding doctors were pissed at their electronic health record, which surprised me because I think we all love our iPhones. And yet I think there's an immense promise over the next 5 to 10 years as we bring in new tools and we get smarter about how to use these tools in the service of our patients and our clinicians. Healthcare knows nothing about digital transformation, about industries getting turned upside down. And you think about virtually every industry, and they have all been turned upside down. Retail, travel, financial services, entertainment, you name it, they've been turned upside down by healthcare, by digital. In our field of medicine, if you look at the list of America's top 10 or 20 health systems, today, it's about the same list as America's top 10 or 20 health systems 100 years ago. What industry is like that? It's sort of, the only other one I can think of is education, is higher education, that has been so, in some ways, untouched by digital transformation. If you think about the unemployment rate among physicians and nurses, essentially zero. So that's just incredibly unusual as you think about the way other industries have been turned upside down. And I do think we're going to hit our moment for better and obviously in some ways for worse, or it'll certainly create stressors as digital finally creates the kind of changes that we're now very used to as we think about how do we buy things, how do we get entertained, how do we get our news, all those sort of things. These are companies that I'm either on the board of directors of or I'm on the scientific advisory board of. I will not mention any of their products, and sort of useful for me in terms of having a deeper understanding of what's happening in the corporate world as it relates to digital health, because I can tell you from my perch as an academician, I see a part of it, but I think there's a lot happening in industry that it's worth understanding. Okay, let's start with Ernest Hemingway, as all good talks do. And Hemingway, in The Sun Also Rises in 1926, one of the characters had gone bankrupt, and another character was talking to him and asking him about how that happened. How did you go bankrupt? And the answer, you may know this quote quite famously, is 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly. And that is my premise for this talk, that we are in what I think of as the Hemingway moment. That certainly the digital transformation of healthcare has been very, very, very gradual. The AI moment has been very, very, very gradual, as you'll hear in a few minutes. But we are in a moment where I think it's probably our suddenly moment. Do I mean suddenly like next week or even next year? Not really. But do I mean suddenly over a 5-ish year time horizon? I think yes. So what I'm going to talk about in 40-ish minutes, the electronic health record era and what it teaches us about digital transformation. And the bottom line is it's harder than it looks and there are more unanticipated consequences. The opportunities and challenges presented by the new AI. I'll be talking a lot about the new AI, but I think it's important to see AI as a continuum. There's a lot of different kinds of AI. Obviously, the cool kid on the block is ChatGPT, but it's really part of a whole spectrum of artificial intelligence, and it kind of all blends together in a way. And is this our AI moment? As I've already hinted at, I think it is, although I don't believe all the hype. And what I'm going to try to do is navigate and help you navigate the path between the hype and the pessimism and doomsaying. All right, so let's talk about for a second the electronic health record era, sort of before we get to AI. And what I think is important to recognize is part of the reason that healthcare is such a laggard in digital transformation is the digitization of healthcare is a very recent phenomenon. So in 2008, fewer than 1 in 10 hospitals had an electronic health record. I was on Google's health advisory board in 2007 when Google, in Google's usual way, said, we're going to go into healthcare and kind of fix you people because you haven't figured it out and we have unlimited wealth and unlimited brilliance and we're just going to do it. And a year later, Eric Schmidt came in and told our advisory board, we're out of business, we're leaving this is too hard for us. It was like, whoa, it must be pretty hard. And the reason it was too hard for them was this, that Google could not do googly things until the record was digitized. So I think it's important to see the last 15 years as essentially foundational. None of the other stuff, including any of the AI stuff, could happen until we began with the data being in digital form, not in paper form. So 2008, fewer than 1 in 10 American hospitals was digital, basically, had an electronic health record. 10 years later, fewer than 1 in 10 was not. And today that number is close to zero. It's very hard to find a health system that still does not have an electronic health record, and probably a couple of those mom and pop 1 and 2Z practices still don't, but they're increasingly rare. So we basically, over the course of 10 years, went from a paper to a digital system. Now, this was me when this was happening. It was like, this is great. I love my iPhone. I love OpenTable. I love Google Maps. It's all great. What could possibly go wrong? And the answer is plenty. And what I'm going to talk about here is the electronic health record version of it. I'll talk about the AI version of this later. I'm going to, in I think 3 slides, summarize, again, a book I read 10 years ago called The Digital Doctor, which was my effort to understand what had gone wrong and why. This is a 7-year-old girl, went to see her pediatrician, and she's something of an artist. She drew this crayon drawing of her visit to the doctor. And she's really quite a wonderful artist, and so it's a beautiful but actually terrifying picture. And you see there the girl, and next to her is her mom and her sister in the corner, and there in the other corner, back to the patient, typing away, is the doctor. Look familiar? Anybody sort of know this scene, right? I think it's a spectacular picture. One thing the girl got wrong, anybody catch it? It's the smile on the doctor's face. I know of absolutely no doctor who is happy about that this is what I have become, this expensive data entry clerk, not making eye contact with my patient. It's incredibly disheartening. It's not what any of us want to do. And this happened because of the electronic health record, and partly because the electronic health records aren't very good, but the electronic health record enabled all of the parties that care about what the doctor does to say, oh, let's just have them document one more thing, except the one more thing became 30 more things, because it was coming from many different angles, and the next thing you know, this is the way a clinic visit looks. Now, 5 years ago, when I asked doctors, what's pissing you off about your electronic health record, they would have said that picture. They would have said documentation burden. They don't say that anymore. They now say their electronic health record inbox. And that's an interesting phenomenon. If you think about that, how did that happen? Well, when Epic first came into my institution, or if you have Epic or Cerner or whatever it was, if you remember, there was no patient portal. It was a provider electronic record system. And then the patient portal came in. That sounded great. We like democratizing medicine. Patients will get all this information. And patients could make appointments and get refills and ask questions. And then eventually, through federal law, we gave them all of their data, including their physician notes and their labs and their x-rays. It all sounded great. But when I go onto my portal for the Bank of America or the United Airlines, I can answer probably 99% of the things I need to do, I can do on that portal. Whereas for patients, they were getting all of this information and having all of these things that they wanted to transact through the portal, and getting, my magnesium is low and my EKG is abnormal. It's like, what does that mean? And then we did this thing that was really very, very clever. We put a little button on the top and it said, send a message to your doctor. And it was free. It solved a problem for the patients. And so, lo and behold, patients did it. And this is at UCSF over the course of 4 or 5 years, partly accelerated by COVID, but not completely. The number of electronic health record inbox messages exploded, and then that became the top complaint of physicians about their electronic health record. And if you think about it, what we did was we enabled 24/7, 365 access by patients to their physicians without giving a second of thought to, like, how is this going to work? What is the business model? What is the workforce model? What is the workflow model? We just sort of turned it on. And I was part of that, and I don't think it's so obvious that this was going to happen, and yet none of us, it's sort of an example of none of us are very good at anticipating what's going to happen when you digitize until you've digitized. And then there are things that are absolutely obvious, but you didn't get it in time. This is an old problem in technology. Henry Ford was reputed to have said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. They had no idea what this thing called a car would do until there were cars. We had no idea what this thing called a patient portal would do until we did it. And then lo and behold, all of the clinicians are on their knees working a full day, and now you have 2 hours of inbox messages that you feel a professional responsibility to answer. And finally, this is sort of the end of kind of the electronic health record era, but this is an ad I found when I was writing my book. This was for an emergency medicine physician job in Arizona 7 or 8 years ago. Arizona General Hospital, it's coming to the state. It's in a Phoenix suburb. It's a 40,000 square foot boutique general hospital, a little tiny general hospital. And then they start the ad for the ER doctor. And here's what they have. They have an ER, which is good. Radiology suite with some of the latest gizmos. A little tiny place, 2 ORs, 16 inpatient rooms, but there was only one part of the ad they decided to put in bold. It was clearly their main selling point. We have no electronic medical record. That is when I knew things were really off the rails, that we truly did not understand the implications of this digital thing that, again, I thought was going to be pretty simple. So the productivity paradox of IT is any kind of digital thing is always super hyped. It probably has to be, because you wouldn't buy it and go through the trouble of dealing with it unless it was hyped. Comes in with great expectations. It looks great in the demos and on the PowerPoint slides. And then you put it in and it does not achieve what you thought it was going to achieve. This has been seen over and over and over again in other industries. In 1986, this Nobel Prize winning economist wrote, "You can see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity statistics." Meaning you went on to, it certainly wasn't talking about healthcare because you could not see the computer age in healthcare, but if you went into the Wall Street trading desk or you went to the factory floor, you'd see lots of computers around, and yet the promised gains in productivity were not realized. Now that's the bad news. The good news is if the technology is any good, think electricity, or think the printing press, or think about the internet, if you think the internet's good, and hopefully the electronic health record, that eventually the paradox goes away. Now, sometimes it takes a couple of years, sometimes it takes 5, sometimes it takes 10. Healthcare, I'd argue we're about 15 years into our electronic health record era, and we're partly unlocking the paradox. Why does it take longer in healthcare? Much more complicated, highly regulated, HIPAA, lots of reasons healthcare would be slower. Not that surprising that it would take longer to achieve the productivity and quality gains that had been promised than it might be in another industry. Eric's key point, I think, is that there are 2 keys to fix that productivity paradox. So I liken it to a safe deposit box. If you only have 1 key, you're not going to do it. 2 things have to happen. One is obvious, which is the technology needs to get better, and you think about the EHR today compared to 10 years ago, still not great, but much better than it was, and think about all of your other digital tools. Think about your Netscape browser versus today's use of something like Chrome. So the technology needs to get better, that's clear. But the more important enabler for achieving the goals you had with the technology is what Eric sometimes calls reimagining the work or complementary innovations. In other words, not so much about the technology, much more about the people, the processes, the work, the workflow. And it just takes a while. What do people do when they invent the technology or bring it in? They just stick it in and keep their old processes because they know of no other way to do it. Why does the electronic health records physician note look like a piece of paper under a tab, and the nurse's notes are pieces of paper under a tab? They're just digital. It's because we didn't imagine or think through what should a note look like today. If you did that, it might look more like a Twitter feed, or it might look like a Facebook wall, or it might look like Wikipedia or Google Docs, or it would have easier use of audio and video. It would have a lot of stuff if you're starting fresh, but we never start fresh. So a lot of this is this idea of how do we rethink the work and the workflow, that it's not so much about the technology, it really is the technology meets the organization, the people, the governance, and that's where things get better when you finally get that stuff under control. It's a good reason to have some young people in your organization, because the older folks don't know any other way than the way they've always done it. The younger folks come in and say, why are we doing this thing this way? Don't you know? And they'll cite an example from the rest of their life where it works really well. And that's when you start unleashing the power of the technology. Okay, so that's kind of all I want to say about the past and the electronic health record here, what got us to the last few years. Will the new AI, GPT-4, et cetera, bypass or shorten the productivity paradox? That's the paper that Eric and I wrote in JAM. And we basically asked two questions. Is the technology now better enough that it will solve problems with less fuss than certainly the electronic health record created? And are there aspects of the current healthcare ecosystem that will make things easier? And our answer to both of those was yes. And that's partly why we think this is going to go faster than digital transformation to date. So let's switch into the sort of the current moment of generative AI. This is the way I think about AI. I know there's this kind of stuff under the hood. I know there's this kind of stuff, this kind of stuff. That's not the way I think about it. I don't think you need to think about it that way. This is the way I think about it. There's like a lot of math and a lot of data. There's a lot of math and a lot of data at the end. There's a miracle that occurs somewhere in the middle. And so that's where I am. This is like, we're talking about the miracle and what this thing can do. I don't think it's that important for health leaders or frontline clinicians to truly understand what's going on under the hood. That's an interesting issue because people talk a lot about explainability. That in order for a doc to trust the AI, they really need to understand like some of that math, what's going into it. And it's like, I don't really know how Tylenol works. I don't really, when I order an SPEP, I don't really know what the lab is doing. I just know it's useful in diagnosing myeloma. I think this explainability thing is a little overrated. So don't worry about it. There's going to be very little math here. All right, now AI in healthcare, you might think it's new, because certainly GPT exploded on the scene 2 years ago, but AI is pretty old in healthcare. There were a number of research groups and startups in the 80s. Now, AI was very different back then. It was a whole bunch of if-then statements that were baked into a set of algorithms that would then come out and do something useful. What they decided to focus on in the beginning was diagnosis. And every now and then it would come up with a really useful thing that the doc hadn't thought of, but every now and then, most of the time, or much of the time, it would be something like this. The doc says rapid pulse, sweating, shallow breathing. According to the computer, you've got gallstones. This guy's got an arrow in his back. It would come up with results that were frankly ridiculous. And so the job at this point was to win over the hearts and minds of clinicians, and it did not do that because its outputs were not useful. And on top of that, because we didn't have electronic health records, if you were going to feed the system, you had to type everything in to the computer, and nobody's going to do that. So it was hard to use, and the output did not lead to useful information for practicing clinicians. And basically, the field kind of died. And it led to something that's known as the AI winter in healthcare, lasted for 20 or 30 years. And for a long time, no one was really talking about AI in healthcare until a few years ago when ChatGPT came out. Now, it can get things wrong, but does it in a way that seems quite human, quite believable. So this is an example I've seen of how we can get in trouble. I need to write a prior authorization to United Healthcare because I want to use a Pixaban, those of you who are not clinicians, a very powerful blood thinner for my patient who's having trouble sleeping. Now, this is wacky. I mean, you should know, for those of you who are not clinicians, this is wacky. A blood thinner for a patient who can't sleep, but GPT 3.5 said, sure, no problem. My patient's been struggling with insomnia, and I believe that a Pixaban, this anticoagulant, may be effective. Yes, I know it's primarily used for blood clots, but recent research has indicated it may have benefits for individuals with insomnia. Now, I'm quoting Sarah, but Sarah told me when she read this, she actually went on to PubMed to see if she'd missed some of the recent research. because she thought she was just sort of spoofing the damn thing, and this is what it does. So very credible, beautifully written, but completely made up, absolutely fabricated. So the fact that the AI can do that, of course, is scary as we're talking about high-stakes decision-making. This is Sam Altman, the leader, now back to be the leader after being fired for a week last year, of OpenAI. And he writes on Twitter a couple of years ago, but I think it's quite relevant. ChatGPT is incredibly limited, but good enough at some things to create a misleading impression of greatness. It's a mistake to be relying on it for anything important right now. It's a preview of progress. We have lots to do on robustness and truthfulness. Better than it was, but still, I think that's an important quote. If you think about what we do for a living, it's important. You want it to be right. It needs to be trustworthy. And the moment we're in is one in which we have to think a lot about that because the stakes are high. And it also determines where you would want your first use cases to be in areas where the stakes are lower. By the way, I asked many of the founding fathers of AI who were doing that work in the 80s, why did you start on the hardest thing, diagnosis? And they, almost to a one, said it just seemed to be the most interesting problem. And many of them were physician informaticists. They wanted to start on a problem that seemed real and important, and the diagnosis seemed logical, even though strategically it turned out to be a bad error. That if they'd started on something simpler, sending a bill or doing a prior auth, they might have gotten some headway. This is just me hearing about a patient and saying, I'm not sure what's going on. And the questions I'm asking of GPT now 4 are the kinds of questions that if I ran into my favorite, in this case, either infectious disease doctor or hepatologist, liver specialist, in the cafeteria, I'd say, let me run a case by you quickly.
He presented with a fever, shortness of breath, and a cough, was found to have pulmonary infiltrates. We started him on Zosyn, and then he was noted to have abnormal LFTs with a pattern of an AST-ALT of about 1,200 and a normal billion alkaline phosphatase. What do you think might be going on with his liver?
It sounds like your patient could be experiencing drug-induced liver injury, DILI, possibly from the Zosyn, piperacillin-tazobactam. Given the dramatic rise in AST and ALT with normal bilirubin and alkaline phosphatase, it suggests hepatocellular injury. Other potential causes to consider include viral hepatitis, ischemic hepatitis, especially if he had a period of hypotension or a flare of his underlying condition. You might want to discontinue the suspected medication and consider further diagnostic workup, including viral serologies, liver imaging, and potentially a liver biopsy if the diagnosis remains unclear.
Thanks very much. That makes a lot of sense. We also thought DILI was the most likely diagnosis, but here was the rub. His abnormal LFTs were noted about 6 hours after the first dose of the Zosyn, and we wondered whether that timing was okay or is that too fast? What do you think?
The rapid onset of liver enzyme elevation within 6 hours of starting Zosyn does seem unusually fast for typical drug-induced liver injury, which usually takes days to weeks to manifest. This rapid change could suggest another cause, such as ischemic hepatitis, which can present with a rapid and significant increase in AST and ALT levels following a hypotensive episode. It's essential to review the patient's hemodynamic status and any recent events that might have caused liver hypoperfusion. Also, consider acute viral hepatitis or other acute liver insults as part of the differential diagnosis.
That's very helpful. Thanks so much. Can you tell me a short poem about DILI, about drug-induced liver injury? Thank you.
Sure, here's a short poem about drug-induced liver injury. A drug prescribed to heal and mend, in rare cases, may offend. The liver, strong, begins to falter. With enzymes rising, health can alter. The silent thief with stealthy tread turns the liver shades of red. Hepatocytes in distress cry, stop the cause or we may die. Yet knowledge shines, a guiding light, to cease the drug and set things right. With careful watch, the liver mends. The patient's health, the story ends.
That's fabulous. Thanks so much.
I thought it was pretty darn helpful. I mean, it's not perfect, and it turned out it was the Zosyn. It was just an unusual case of a very rapid, probably hypersensitivity reaction to Zosyn. So that's sort of on the, I dissuaded it by that time course at the end. But the differential diagnosis, I think, was fine. I mean, those are the main causes. I think it gave me what to think of and the risk factors. If I got that answer calling a colleague who was a specialist, I'm a generalist, I'm a hospitalist, I would say that's a pretty good answer. It's the kind of answer if I got from somebody in the cafeteria, I'd feel like it advanced my understanding of the case. It's not perfect, but pretty darn good. Okay, so 3 months after that blood thinner for insomnia thing, I'm sorry, but there appears to be a misunderstanding here. There is no scientific basis or evidence suggesting that this blood thinner is effective or appropriate for insomnia. Therefore, it would be unethical and inappropriate to draft such a request. So one of the things that's challenging about following this field is you may have an impression that this thing is not good enough for prime time, but 6 months later, it's better than it was. It might be tomorrow, it's better than it was, and it creates a huge problem in the regulatory environment. If you're the FDA and you're saying, all right, is this new antibiotic any good? You're regulating it, and that is the same antibiotic they're going to be using 3 years from now, whereas the day you say something about generative AI, the next day it might be better than it was. It could be worse too, but in general, it's getting better over time. Now, a lot of you probably saw the early literature on how amazing this was, and obviously in the old days, beating the chess champions, and then all sorts of other things. And then once GPT came out, passing the licensing exam, passing the boards exams in every field, passing the law boards as well. And that was all kind of fine and okay. But how about real world situations? And then about a year ago, literature research started coming out looking at real world situations, or at least as close as they could get. This is a study that a number of business professors did with Boston Consulting Groups, one of the top national consulting groups. And they said, we want to help a hypothetical shoe company on its business and marketing strategy. This was not the shoe that they came up with, by the way. Then they said, we need to know what kind of shoe we should design. We need to know whether we should have brick and mortar stores or virtual sales. We need to know what our marketing campaign is and who the target audience is. We need to know our competition. And what they did was they took Boston Consulting Group and basically divided into two halves. One half, they used all the usual tools they would use to do such things. The other half, they allowed them to use GPT while they were doing it. And this is the independent ratings of the quality of their consultation. And you see here a very, very significant improvement in the quality in the group that used the AI. And one of the interesting things that's being seen in study after study, including in healthcare settings, is the improvement was far greater in the folks who started in the bottom half of the skill level, meaning that either they were young or inexperienced, or they, for other reason, were rated as having lower skills. They improved by 43%, whereas the top half skilled participants were improved as well, but only by 17%. So one of the messages here is this thing helps people bypass their learning curve. And as we think about the role of APPs, it will come up. Part of what, if you have APPs in your world, this is either an opportunity or a threat, depending on where they sit in your organization. Can you bring people who are lesser skilled? I don't know that I want them to be getting all of their education online, but that's a different issue, but are lesser skilled up to a level of that's equivalent to someone who's more experienced and more skilled. And it looks like if you insert this AI in the right place, you move people through their learning curve much more quickly. Now, how about in healthcare? So again, lots of evidence that it could pass a test, but that's not the same as taking care of real patients. So this is a study that came out now earlier this year from a group at Google that had created a bunch of case scenarios and then used this thing they called AMI, Articulate Medical Information Explorer, basically a chatbot tuned on listening to thousands of doctor-patient interactions. What they did then, as you might expect, is they ran virtual visits, either having primary care doctors on the other end or this Google chatbot on the other end, and then evaluated it in terms of the quality of the medical care. Did they get the diagnosis right? Was the escalation strategy, triage strategy correct? And also importantly, in terms of empathy and communication. Now, I remember myself a year or two ago, all right, maybe this thing can at some point be smarter than me and make the diagnosis better, but we always have empathy. Patients are going to want to see a doctor. Okay, maybe. This is what a conversation looked like with the chatbot. Patient says, I felt like there was a heavy weight on my chest, extended to my upper stomach, not described as burning or stabbing, more like pressure. And then the AI says, that's a very clear description, thank you. See, it's nice too, so why not be nice to it? It helps me narrow down possibilities, but to give you the best advice, I need more background. What's your age? Do you have any of the significant medical history? And it basically has a conversation back and forth. This is a spider plot. On the left is the subspecialist ratings of diagnostic accuracy management plan and escalation or triage. If the AI was better, the pink goes out further than the blue. And as you see here, the AI was either equal to or better than the primary care docs. Again, these were rated blindly by subspecialists looking at the transcripts. The part that's a little bit scarier or more exciting, depending on who you're rooting for, is the AI did better than the humans in perceived openness and honesty, patient's confidence in care, and significantly better in empathy. So, yeah, wow is right. Now, I'm old enough that I don't care that much, but I have a daughter who's a third-year medicine resident, and it makes me worried if it's actually not only better at diagnosing, but better at empathy than we are. So it is clearly ready for prime time in some way. This is how it did on the top 10 diagnoses, and it was better than the docs in every single one of the diagnoses. All right, will it require fewer complementary innovations? Very little user training. It's pretty easy out of the box to use, much easier integration into electronic health records. As I said before, I advise a bunch of companies. There's a huge amount of stuff happening in the world of Silicon Valley startups in this area. Obviously, a lot of them will fail, but some of them are pretty cool in developing tools that I think will be useful. And as I said, I think we've all gotten better at thinking about digital and bringing it into our world than we were. And the shortage of providers and the burnout of providers, we can't possibly meet the needs of our patients just with human capital. Even if we had enough money to hire all the FTEs we needed, they're not there. So there's a pull here in a way that might not have been true 20 years ago. All right, what could go wrong in AI? And the answer is plenty. The one I'm particularly fond of, because part of what I do is we think about medical education at UCSF and how do we train the next generation of doctors, is sort of the interaction between the humans and the AI. And here, to me, is the problem of human vigilance as it pertains to AI. If the AI was right half the time, it would be worthless and we wouldn't use it. Think about if your spell checker was right half the time. It would create more work for you to go back and read it over. So if it doesn't reach some threshold of accuracy, it's not going to have any chance of being useful. Now, on the other pole, if it's right 100% of the time, that's pretty great. I don't know what any of us are going to do for a living, but for patients, you know, if you have a system that's giving the right diagnosis, making the right treatment recommendations, guiding them to the right medicines, answering their questions, and doing it at essentially zero or very low marginal cost, if you're a patient, that sounds pretty great, and particularly if it turns out that losing their contact with me does not lead to a decrease in the amount of empathy, at least that they perceive. You know, I guess I don't know what, if medicine goes away as a profession, I'm not sure what other, people ask me like, if you think they're not gonna be doctors, what would you tell your kids to do? And I think doctors are pretty late in this, so I actually have no idea what they're gonna do, because it probably means almost every other profession is also compromised by AI. But in any case, we're probably not gonna be at 100% accuracy anytime soon. So the real issue that we're going to confront for the next foreseeable future is going to be that it's right most of the time, right often enough that you think it's useful to have it in your world and go through the trouble of implementing it and paying for it, but it's not perfect. And therefore, your safety system will inevitably be, there is a human in the loop. There's the person who's doing the ultimate, the final sign-off. That's probably the way it's going to look in high-stakes areas like most of healthcare. It's mostly right, it's periodically wrong, and you have the human doing the final check. And so we will be tasked with being the safety bulwarks, the safety protectors. There's a problem with that, though, and there are a few problems with that I just want to highlight for you because I think they are worth thinking about. And the two main ones are de-skilling and automation complacency. 40-ish years ago in the cockpit of a big plane, there used to be 3 humans. It was a pilot, co-pilot, and a flight engineer. They bagged the flight engineer once they had computerized maps. They didn't need that anymore. So they just have two people there, in part in case one of them drops dead, but in part to spell each other and check each other's work a little bit. And there's a saying in aviation that eventually, the planes can basically fly themselves now. Eventually, there will be two beings in the cockpit, but it will be a pilot and a dog. And the punchline is the pilot is there to keep the dog company. The dog is there to bite the pilot if he tries to touch the controls. So maybe, that may be where we're going. But then the example of self-driving cars comes up. So if you read the Tesla owner's manual, here's something that's in it. This was written clearly by a bunch of very high-priced lawyers with very good senses of humor. They say the currently enabled autopilot, enhanced autopilot, and full self-driving features, they call it full self-driving, requires active driver supervision and does not make the vehicle autonomous. To call this thing full self-driving to say it's not autonomous is pretty funny, I think. So why do they say that? There have been a number of cases that are sadly exactly this. This is one from a few years ago where a truck came in front of the Tesla did not see it, and the driver had about, I think it was, 300 feet to see this, react to it, and slam on the brakes. And of course, sadly, that did not happen. And the truck sheared off the top of the car and the top of the driver. And there are a number of accidents like this while the car was on full self-driving. So this, which is basically how can a human stay awake, alert, and vigilant when this thing is doing this thing autonomously, incredibly well and correct 99.99% of the time. That's a problem that we're going to have to deal with in healthcare, because invariably, if we're signing off on something that's been right the last 99 times, we're not paying attention. That's just natural. So in another paper we had in JAMA recently, we talked a little bit about what could happen, what could you do to increase the probability that this digital human dyad would work better. And here are the things we sort of mused about. That the AI companies, and I've spoken to several of them, do say that they have the capacity, and they're working on this, to signal the level of uncertainty. So you can imagine that the AI itself says, here is something that I'm just not as sure about, and it's important. It will know how important the thing is. And so when it shows it to the clinician, it's in red. So a signal to the clinician, pay a lot of attention to this, is a strategy that might help get over this issue of complacency. Flip the order. This might be particularly useful for diagnosis, where the human says, here's what I think the diagnoses are, and then the AI says, oh, that's a good list, and I'd also add this thing, which is different than the AI giving you the list and you kind of turning your brain off. You could do deliberate shocks. I don't know if you know this, but TSA periodically throws in a picture, an image of a bomb and a gun into the feed that the TSA agents are seeing, a fake bomb or gun, to see if they're awake and alert. They actually miss a lot of them, unfortunately. It's a little scary. And it's the equivalent of fish testing in your corporate email, where they deliberately throw something in, basically to keep you on your toes, and then at least theoretically, if you miss all of them, something bad happens to you. Maybe your AI privileges get cut off or something. Stress test the entire system. When you study, is this thing working? It's just not how well does the AI work, but how well do the AI plus the people work. And this is a really important one, particularly those of you who run health systems. What happens, and we'll talk about digital scribes and things that are going to save the clinician's time. If you save the clinician a certain amount of time in their day because you have an ambient scribe creating their note, what happens with that time? Now, the natural inclination of a health system, of course, will be to repurpose that time by making the hamster wheel spin that much faster and you see that many more patients, which not only doesn't help, but actually will hurt burnout, because actually some of the downtime was a time the docs could catch their breath. And so an important set of corporate decisions is, how do you deal with efficiencies? And my guess is you do have to expect some improvement in efficiency by the provider, but if all of it gets put into the hamster wheel spinning faster, you probably haven't helped safety, you may have even hurt it. Okay, so let me move to the end here. If you are interested in AI and where it's going and what the latest tools and thinking are, would highly recommend this book and the Substack from Professor Ethan Mollick. And here are his 4 rules for co-intelligence. He says, always invite AI to the table. In other words, you got to start using it. You got to try it in different, obviously in low stakes things, but I use it all the time now. I now use it mostly instead of Google when I have a question about anything. To understand its limitations and ability, and obviously you need to stay within the guidelines. Try to be the human in the loop, and it's you're designing systems, mitigate the things that make it hard to get that right. Treat AI like a person, but tell it what kind of a person it is. And so this idea of prompting it in certain ways, he likes to think of the AI as a good intern, like someone who's pretty reliable, will go and do stuff for you, answer questions for you, but is not perfect. And assume that this is the worst AI you'll ever use. So your judgment about how it is today, and it got this thing wrong, and therefore I'm not going to use it. That's the AI today. Tomorrow it will probably be better. And I think these are useful rules as you think about it. So how about in healthcare? I think it's best to view the past decade as foundational, that we were sort of getting our act together for this moment. The EHR will serve as the scaffolding for other tools. Your people are going to use generative AI whether you like it or not, so you need to build the capacity for them to use it in the way you want them to use it. Early wins, I think, will be in logistics and operations, back office stuff, scheduling, billing, and rather than in high-stakes clinical areas like diagnosis and therapy. But I think ultimately they will come, because the real mileage here is in clinical decision support, is in helping doctors get to the right diagnosis, deliver the right treatment. But I think the way that they will move into healthcare is beginning with solving problems for clinicians like documentation. Other things to think about: expect predictable problems like bias, hallucinations, and automation complacency, and then there will be inevitably unpredictable ones. But I think the stage is set for digital transformation. We got to figure out how to govern it and how to study it. And I'll show just a couple of people at my institution who just in the last couple of years taken new roles. Julie Adler-Milstein runs a new division that we have on clinical informatics and digital transformation to study this stuff and what's working and what's not. And Sarah has this new role helping us think about AI. Particularly if you're in a big healthcare organization, you don't have someone in charge of your AI work, it's worth thinking about having such a person, because it's just so much going on and so complex. And I do think this will be our Hemingway moment. I think the power of the tool combined with the needs of the healthcare systems will lead to our gradually then suddenly moment. Thank you so much.